Let's add our first action. Think of FreshAiR actions as a way to modify or change the behavior of your reality in real time to your user. This could include a number of different things, but for now, let's use one of the simpler examples for actions, which is setting the visibility and accessibility for your location triggers. Let's explain a little bit what that means first before we start populating actions. In the reality I have going right now, we have 4 different locations. As you will recall, locations per se are not what the FreshAiR user will actually see. Locations are just identifiers to populate into triggers. The triggers themselves define what the FreshAiR user will see. They could be at certain locations, or as we've done in previous tutorials, they could be at the start of the reality, or they could be triggered by different means. But this distinction between locations and triggers is more important now than ever. But let's take a look at our locations for a moment. We have here 4 locations: water, matches, medical kit, and rifle and shells. Okay, now let's take a look at our corresponding triggers. We do have a start of the reality trigger, that's good, and we also have 4 other triggers, one that corresponds to each location. So the basic idea I have here for this example is I want the FreshAiR user playing my reality to only see one of these triggers at a time. Perhaps first the matches trigger, then the rifle and shells trigger, then the water trigger, then the medical kit. It's important to note, however, that by default, FreshAiR shows all available location triggers at once. We call this visibility. There's another state to think about as well here: accessibility. So let's talk briefly about those two terms. Visibility pertains to whether the trigger is actually visible to the user or not. Accessibility pertains to whether the content is actually accessible to the user when they attempt to trigger it. Let's go into a few examples of that. If a trigger is both visible and accessible, as all triggers by default start out as, that means it'll appear normally on the screen for the user when they look toward it, and when they attempt to walk toward it or click on it by whatever criteria you've defined in your triggers view here, they'll actually be able to access it. The other cases actually help flesh out how to think about this more. Imagine you have water here as a trigger that's visible but not accessible. What would this look like, and how would this play out in a FreshAiR reality? That would mean this marker and this trigger would actually be visible to the user, but even if they went within range, as defined here, within 23 feet to trigger it, it would not trigger if it was not accessible. Even if they clicked on it, it would not trigger and show the content if it was not accessible. It would simply do nothing. That would be an example of making a trigger visible but not accessible. This could be used for great narrative purposes if you want a trigger that's shown but not interacted with by the user. On the other hand, perhaps you'd like some sort of invisible trigger that is accessible by the user, but it's never displayed or visible. In that case, you'd want your trigger to be non-visible but accessible. In certain circumstances, you may actually want a trigger to be neither at first. In the example I'd like to demonstrate in this reality, I'd like my users to only be able to trigger and see one of these triggers at a time. As FreshAiR by default has all location triggers accessible and visible at the beginning of the reality, we'll have to define each of these triggers to be non-visible and non-accessible to be able to set up that sort of pathing I'd like. So let's show how to do that now. This is all accomplished through actions. Actions are set in your triggers view. Clicking on triggers view, a great place to define initial actions, such as what I'm going for here, turning off the visibility and accessibility of most of these location triggers, is done right at the start of the game. Actions are defined underneath content for each trigger. To add our first action, click on the Add Action button. You'll see a drop-down category, and you'll see a couple of different action types. For this example, let's select a triggers action type. You'll notice this is actually a complete sentence that you're filling out here. This is helpful to think of when you're trying to understand how actions work. The sentence reads so far: set the visibility and accessibility of select a trigger as not visible and not accessible to player. And there's a check mark. Okay, so let's fill this out. What I'm trying to accomplish is setting the visibility and accessibility of each of these location triggers, except for the first one, matches, to non-visible, non-accessible. The reason is I want my user to initially only be able to interact with and see the matches trigger. Once they've seen the matches trigger, I'll then want them to be able to interact only with the rifle and shells trigger. Once they've done that, I'll want to do the same thing where only the water trigger is visible and accessible, and then once they've done that, I'll want the same thing for this last trigger, medical kit. In this way, I'm making a linear experience for my user. So set the visibility accessibility of select a trigger. Clicking on this drop down, I'll want to select the first trigger I want to turn off. I want matches to stay on, but I'll want the rifle and shells trigger, the water trigger, and a medical kit trigger to be non-visible and non-accessible when my reality starts. So for this action, I'll choose rifle and shells. Set the visibility accessibility of rifle and shells as not visible and not accessible to player. Once I have this the way I want it, I'll want to make sure I hit the check mark here. If this isn't the way I like, I can click on it to edit it, or simply click the X button. Great. I'll want to continue doing this for the other 3 triggers I want to have hidden when the reality starts. And then I'll want to hit save. At this point, if you were to play this FreshAiR Reality, you'll see the Daring Entrepreneur content triggered at the start of the reality, and then immediately you'll only be able to see the matches trigger, but not the other ones. So far, so good. Now we'll want to set up subsequent actions, so that when the user reaches the matches trigger will no longer be visible or accessible to the user. And also, the rifle and shells trigger will be visible and accessible to the user, leading the user on a linear path. We'll want to do this logically in the action for the matches. We'll create a new action, select the triggers category, and then select matches itself to turn the visibility and accessibility of this content that the user has just seen to not visible and not accessible. We'll want to add another action where we turn the visibility and accessibility of the upcoming rifle and shells location trigger to visible and accessible to the player. In this way, think of it as turning off content that the user has just seen and turning on the next piece of content that you wish the user to see in a linear fashion. We'll do this for each of the subsequent triggers in turn. Great. This is an excellent place to hit save and check out how your reality is shaping up on the FreshAiR app. A further note with actions, feel free to continue hitting add action and explore different categories and different options for each category. Keep in mind this area is actually a button you can change. For the triggers category, every time you click the button, it toggles between 3 different types, setting both the visibility and accessibility at once for convenience, setting just the visibility, or setting just the accessibility. You can use these different types of actions for triggers to create some of those different scenarios we talked about earlier, where a trigger is visible to a user but not accessible, or accessible to a user but not visible, things of that nature. In subsequent tutorials, we'll get more in depth about the power of different actions.